So hello, everyone. Great to have you here this evening to join us. I'm Catherine. I work for the Stove Network in Dumfries and have been part of our core team here, exploring and developing both our ways of working with creativity as part of our local community, and also in thinking about that as an approach to working from within communities that can be shared and joined up with other places regionally. This is the second in a series of online events the Stove is hosting to explore creative and community embedded working between artists and community groups, other individuals, partners who have the intent on affecting change for the places that they live. This is an approach to working that the Stove has been developing and testing and exploring with others that we're now talking about as creative placemaking. We define creative placemaking as a community-led approach that uses creativity and activity to support collective decision-making and have a positive effect for the people it involves and a positive change for the places that they live. This is an intentional way of talking about and repositioning this term within place development, planning, and regeneration to describe a grassroots approach to working from within communities that's driven and led by those communities to both grow their places and, like I said, support the people that live there. And we think it's often an approach that can support those who are less heard or present in decision-making spaces. So this series of webinar discussions is part of a month of online activities, digging down into the principles of community-led working between community groups and artists and other partners, and to talk about some of the main themes that we see emerging in that work, which are space, physical and conversational, which we focused on in the last webinar, people and power, which we're talking about today, communities, creative practice, and society and activism. This evening, we're joined by Adrian Sinclair from, actually, I just need to make sure I've got the wrong notes. I need to get your bio up, Adrian. 2 minutes, everybody. This is nice and wait a minute. So we're joined by Adrian, who I met last year and really was excited to bring him in to talk to us about his work. He is a co-founder of Heads Together and also works for the Northern School of Creativity and Activism. He's going to sort of talk to the theme of people and power. We've been thinking about how we shift power to within communities. What is it that brings us together, helps shape shared goals and community-led futures for the places that we live, and the role of creative practice in this. Adrian has been involved with radical and social change movements since the 1980s, including founding Leeds-based Heads Together Productions, and brings his experience in a range of place-based work, community theatre, to collaborative documentaries, and even laying 800 square meters of turf on a residential street, leading to government policy change and a 60 million investment in home zones across England. So we're delighted to have him. Today he'll be talking about his work and sharing insights into the challenges of bringing people together, finding a common purpose, building partnerships over time, and understanding where the power is within those relationships. So with that, Adrian, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I am going to share my screen. Obviously, you can look at me if you want, but it's a bit boring after a while. I can't look at you. There's just a range of boxes on the screen. It's a very odd situation to be in. But anyway, if I share my screen, you should be able to see the opening slide, which is just me and, well, title and a bunch of logos. Quite a lot of logos. I could have gone for more actually, but this will do. So Heads Together Productions, as Catherine mentioned, and these are the bits that I wanted to talk about today: Chapel FM and East Leeds FM, over in East Leeds, and Union, the Northern School for Creativity and Activism, or you might see it as the Southern School for Creativity and Activism, Northern England. But yeah, that's what I want to do. So let's just check things work. So I was asked to talk about people and power. I can't quite remember how it came up, and it felt like there were lots of different ways to go about it, but I'm kind of going to stick quite close to what it says on the Eventbrite thing. Can we shift power to within our communities? So actions come from a place and are not done to a place. What is it that brings us together, helps shape shared goals and move towards new community-led futures for our places? And can creative practice help give people more power and help underrepresented voices be heard in decision making? So what I thought I'd do is give you a little bit of background about myself, not much, a bit of context. I think that's quite important. And then take two examples from my experience, examples on quite a different scale, and then sort of draw a few kind of grander thoughts, and not really conclusions, but hopefully something that will open up a good discussion and questions for the interesting bit when I shut up. And Catherine, do tell me if I'm kind of going on for too long and stuff. Give us a shout, maybe 10 minutes before
okay,
I should finish.
I'll keep you to time.
Thank you. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So a little bit of context for me. So I suppose, as Catherine said, an activist, social activist, sort of fell into that. I don't know, this is 1982, I think this is Upper Hayford Air Force Base. The person right at the front with hair, that's my hair. I don't have that anymore. Up in the top right-hand corner, there's also my first summons for, what is it? Obstructing workmen by lying on the ground in front of the tractor, stopping the passage of said workmen using this tractor, and refused to move when requested to do so. So this was part of the peace movement, which is a big thing, obviously, in the 80s, the anti-nuclear movement. Upper Hayford, which is now, it's interesting for me in a sense. I've been back to Upper Hayford. Upper Hayford is it's a heritage site now. You can actually go around the bunkers, and I can tell you, it is as scary as we thought it was. It does feel that actually they could have pressed the wrong button quite easily. But it is closed down. And again, it's one of those things where in some ways, I think sometimes when we do achieve things, we don't really necessarily celebrate them. Anyway, that's my background. And I suppose it was the peace movement that kind of sort of opened my eyes to creativity and what could happen. It was an incredibly creative movement. All sorts of things were happening all the time and in a very creative way. And they were the things that really impacted on people in terms of protests and stuff. We set up at the same sort of time what was the Physical Theatre Company. So dance-based and theatre-based, and this is some of our, Threading the Worm was our first ever performance at Leeds City Art Gallery, various other things, still with hair on these pictures. So it was separate, but it wasn't separate. There was something for me that sort of linked in quite closely. And again, things like pollution, we did take on some themes that were very much around activism. So over the years, lots of different things that we've worked on, that I've worked on. So outdoor theatre, creating books, a bit of synchronized swimming, photography, radio. Someone once sort of said that our company, Heads Together Productions, was media agnostic. And I suppose that's true. We didn't care. We talked about creativity with purpose. We always said that actually it should be the other way around. It doesn't sound as good if you say purpose with creativity, but the purpose comes first. What are we trying to achieve? And the core themes, looking back on it, this isn't something we started with or I started with, but looking back on it, the core themes of all the work that we've been involved with is around communication and I suppose creative ways to communicate. And I'll talk a little bit more later about communicating between groupings of people. I suppose communication is always between, but it's how you communicate between people who aren't necessarily well well engaged with each other. I think that was quite important. Identities, not identity, not just around self-image, although some of my early work was very much working with young people around their self-image, but the sort of multiple identities that people have, including community identities, and I think that's really important. And then participation. And I know in the arts world, people always talk about participation as though it's about participating in the arts. And although I kind of think that's a nice thing, for me, it's about democratic participation, how people participate in the democratic processes, how they take power, own things, develop things together. So a couple of examples, as I said, and this is the first one, and it's an age ago, back in the 90s, and it's an initiative which very much came from that community, which is important. In fact, and as I've said, it was a woman called Rita at number 4 Methley Place. I lived on number 32 Methley Terrace, and she invited her neighbours to come and talk about the streets and about kids playing in the streets, and how, as the only shared spaces in the Methleys, what we could do to make those better. And the Methleys, it's an interesting thing. I often think maybe the planners in the 1890s, when they were built, thought about it specifically, but they made these areas in Leeds. So this was Methley Lane, Methley Place, Methley Terrace. It was very difficult to find the different roads, but it created an identity. And around 300 houses, that's a good sized space. The kids who were there knew that they could be told, don't go out for the Methleys. That was a good sort of space to have. But how could you change the streets? How could you make them better? Well, maybe our idea was, what if we tried doing something just for a weekend? And I'm going to shut up. There's a bit of footage from the national news, it was, which explains.
First tonight, parents in Leeds have declared war on the car and reclaimed the roads. They've paved the street outside their homes with grass in an attempt to provide a safer environment for their children. The campaign group Transport 2000 says it hopes the move will encourage others to seize the initiative. Our West Yorkshire reporter Geeta Gurumurthy is in the Methley area of the city.
This street has too few people and too many cars. That's the complaint of some residents here who've today created an oasis of green. The residents of Methley Terrace have raised £2,000 to turf it all over. They want a space for their children to play, for neighbours to come out and watch the world go by. And this is the launch of their street takeover bid. 8 o'clock this morning, watering cans at the ready, and 800 square metres of turf was delivered to a terraced street like any other until now. Children here this weekend are being treated to a village fete, a mini Olympics and an outside cinema screening. Motorists are being asked to drive 10 miles an hour, and the pressure group Transport 2000 is using this to launch a national campaign to cut traffic levels.
I think it's absolutely wonderful that a community can come together and everybody contribute.
It's a change for people around here because it's just all road.
We're lucky to live here really, because there's not many places like this.
And not many people that do this.
By simply laying down some grass, many here hope to show how a street can literally come to life. Well, this street has certainly never seen anything quite like it before, and the children haven't stopped playing out here all day. The man whose idea it was is Adrian Sinclair of the Methleys Neighbourhood Action Group. Adrian, tell me why you wanted to do this here.
Well, we knew we wanted to have some sort of festival on the streets. We had one last year, and it seems to be something that's very good around here.
And she's enjoying it.
Absolutely. And we thought, well, we haven't got any green spaces in the Methleys, and that's one of the things that, from our consultation with residents, they've said they wanted.
And so it goes on, blah, blah, blah. You don't want to hear any more from me, although that is my daughter. She will come back later in the presentation, but that was a while ago. So that was the Methleys. That was doing something, creating a shared space. And I suppose it's looking at the role of art that gave people the opportunity to play, but it also modelled change. And I think that's really important. Modelling for me is absolutely crucial in all that. It gave an opportunity for consultation, conversation, imagination. What would it be like if? Because although we could maybe imagine, and I suppose that's been the nice thing of my work, is I'm allowed to imagine, not everybody is that good at it, and not everybody is confident about imagining change. So the music, the cinema, the sports and the heritage, the brass bands and the egg and spoon races, it gave people that sort of opportunity, but it also gave the power of opportunity to that community. Suddenly people were saying, well, why couldn't we? What about if? And it changed the narrative very much about within that community, from being a defensive, we've got to keep cars off the streets, what about the kids, all that sort of stuff, to a positive opportunity of how could we change this. Long story short, 6 years later, in 2002, the Methley's Home Zone was launched. So I'm not going to go into, and it's not just about that event, it's not just about creativity. We did change national government policy, and that was a big thing to do, and it wasn't just us, and it wasn't just about being creative. It was a lot of campaigning. We worked with Transport 2000, the Children's Play Council. We went down to the House of Commons. We did an awful lot, which you couldn't say was creative work, but it was about sort of finding that space, using the opportunity, and developing things over time. £60 million of investment into home zones across England. At the same time, within the Methleys, we designed and created a home zone in the Methleys, so one of the first in the country. And all the way through that, young people were at the forefront of the project. In fact, it was 10 young people from the Methleys who launched the campaign at the House of Commons in London. And one of the nice things was that it inspired other communities across the country to do the same, and there was money to do it. However, I think, it's a fantastic story. And I think going back to those original sort of ideas, can we shift power? This certainly wasn't done to a place. It came from that place. They wanted to do it. They didn't know to begin with. Rita didn't sort of kind of go, we want a home zone. In fact, when we did the initial consultation, none of us have ever heard of a home zone or a Wunurfen, which is the Dutch model. And it was only working with an architect who said what you're talking about, what the kids were talking about. Did a survey with the kids, and the kids, when they were asked where would we play, the older kids kind of said, well, what about using the school playground? We're not allowed in there. Or what about this part of the street? The younger kids, and I am talking 2- and 3-year-olds, said outside our houses or in every street. And that's when the architect said, they're talking about a Wunurfen. That's what it means. So it's that bit of understanding, enabling a community to understand what the possibilities are, not just assuming that they know, but they know what might be possible, and looking at working with them to actually change things. What is it that brings us together? Well, the shared spaces. What is it that's shared in a community? What is the sort of common purpose? What's the key bit? And it suddenly realised that the space between the houses was absolutely key in this. And can creative practice help in getting more people and underrepresented voices heard in decision making? Well, I think in this case, obviously yes. it was a way of actually, even just the sort of the whole publicity around that turfing of the street and stuff suddenly started conversations going, started to change things and made an impact. But we created a new look for the Methleys, and it was lovely to be part of. It took a long time, we took about 8 years from start to finish to actually change something, to actually make changes, but that felt for that community the right sort of time. It felt that people needed that time to sort of process things and move forward. And across the country, well, £60 billion worth of home zones, but, and this is a big but for me, and it comes, it's the quote that there's a friend of mine, a mentor, he's sadly passed away now, Bert Mulder, who was at the time IT advisor to the Dutch Parliament, very interested in creativity, but he was not talking about the arts when he talked about this. He was talking about every policy. Why is it that whenever we take good ideas or even good practice and try to make strategies for them, the whole thing dies before our eyes? And what he was saying was that unless we can crack that, it's not going to change. And certainly the home zone strategy, I think in lots of ways wasn't successful. And There are lots of reasons we could talk about them, and I think it's really important that we keep trying to understand the answer to that question. But as Bert pointed out, nobody can really work that out. But one of the things that was taking something that comes from a community and kind of going, this is such a good idea, it can happen in other places, suddenly becomes top down. Suddenly becomes people saying, would you want this? Is this the right thing? And it doesn't have that same sort of discussion, community involvement. It doesn't have a Rita starting in every community and actually starting that open question about what we do. It tries to give solutions, and actually questions are much more interesting in terms of bringing people together. So I don't know the answer. I in some ways pity people in government because they do take good practice. We do present them with good practice and kind of go, you should be doing more of this, and then it doesn't work. So second example, different scale, onto Seacroft, which is nowhere near the sea. It's and on a much larger scale, East Leeds, an area of about 160,000 people. We've worked there, well, the company Heads Together has worked there since 1998. In fact, in the early 2000s, we were challenged by consultant who was working with us at the time to stay put. There's lots of work available, lots of possibilities. And she said, well, what happens if when the money runs out, we were involved with the original Creative Partnerships program at the beginning. She said, what happens if you stay put? And that felt like a really important thing, that rather than following the work, that just we'd go somewhere else and enjoy that process, that actually what happens if we stay put? And we have. But what do we know about Seacroft? And I think that's really important, that, you know, we are outsiders in the place. We can look at the statistics, and the statistics are important. I know that people in Seacroft, in terms of their life expectancy, it's 8 years shorter than the average in Leeds. So I know, I don't feel that I have to go further. Every statistic about the place shows that it is an area of poverty and has a tradition of that. It's embedded in the place. But maybe we should listen to the people. So let me just play a little bit.
How would I describe it from someone not from here? It is underrated as an area to live.
In a lot of ways, it's a kind of a typical old-fashioned kind of East Leeds community. There's a lot of people who've been here for a long time. It can be quite insular, but it's also very kind of committed to itself as an area.
It's a factory estate, basically. A lot of houses here are based on, obviously, the factories that are just up top end of Seacroft. Seacroft doesn't have a culture in a way.
Well, I've lived in Seacroft almost 17 years, so can I be negative? So there's not much for younger people, I don't think. Like, there's no opportunities other than like Chapel FM. There's not close. You have to like go to town. You have to travel to do things you want.
It's quite diverse. There's a lot of there's many different types of people live here. There's some nice parts, some rough parts, but it's just like any other area in Leeds, isn't it? Like I don't think there's as much in Seacroft as like Headingley and Alwoodley, because I think they're more student orientated places, because obviously the uni's around there and they're closer to like Leeds City Centre. I think there needs to be more in Seacroft, to be honest, to make it seem more desirable to come to. It's more than just like a council estate. Do you know what I mean?
So for me, Seacroft is a place so full of potential, so full of untapped kind of possibilities, which is often referred to in the negative and in a deficit model. But for me, come to a green place and try and look and see some of the amazing things that are there.
Seacroft's not one thing. My experience of the children of Seacroft has been that there's a huge variety in their background and their expectations, going from children who wore their pyjamas under their school uniform to children who only had their school uniform, to children who had come from other countries and were highly aspirational and went on to be incredibly successful. And
so there's some things about Seacroft and East Leeds, and you know, that bit's about, it's not one thing. We can't work in a community, and particularly if somewhere that big, and kind of go, well, actually we know all about it. It's completely different things to different people, from people who've lived there to people who've moved into the area. As Jeremy was saying, as head teacher at the end, people who move in and actually do really well. You know, how does that change the sort of narrative of the area and stuff? So back in 2003, we started one project. We worked there for 5 years, but what came up was the idea, well, actually it came up from working with a school, John Smeaton, Community High School, and they'd been criticised by Ofsted. So we were working with them as part of the Creative Partnerships initiative. And their criticism, Ofsted's criticism, was that they didn't involve families. And we'll come back to that sort of issue, how important that is. And we said to them, well, the thing is, you're on the edge of the city. There's been schools closed down, so a lot of the kids bus out to you. There is no chance when it comes to open evenings that parents who don't have cars and there is no public transport in the evening are going to come to open evenings or pupil evenings and stuff. So why don't we do something different? So we set up this community radio station for them, run initially by 15-year-olds. What happened then was that it just spiraled. It was one of those ideas when we realized that the 15-year-olds loved it, but actually so did the 30-year-olds and so did the 70-year-olds. In fact, we ended up with generations of families coming into the studio and stuff, and they wanted it to continue. So we made this offer in a sense, and I think this is important and comes back to something I'll talk about later. We made an offer and the response was positive, and so we went with it and developed this community radio station. It's radio, but so much more. So it included outside broadcasts, it included With a Caravan of Love, it included musicians, hundreds of musicians playing, and our own associate band program. It included a next generation training program for young people. And you get to this point when Joe, the quote from him, never did I think I would end up in a mosh pit dressed as the Joker with an 11-year-old suspended above me crowd surfing. But that's community radio. For him, that was. And Joe, interestingly, is probably 32, 33 now. And Joe is Dr. Foster now. He's a GP. And again, it's one of the things that's really developed over the years. Because we've been there that long, we have proper role models. We have role models who come from the streets that the kids come from now, who come back and actually talk about their experience. We have scientists, we have some artists, we have some musicians, we have people who work for the civil service, all sorts of different things who are the role models. So it changes the narrative of Seacroft being an area where people don't achieve. And for me, that's really important. So one of the things that people then said was that we enjoyed ELFM. We did it peripatetically in different spaces, usually derelict rent offices. We went through a whole series of derelict spaces. We were really good at just making use of them. Meanwhile spaces, as Emma was talking about last week. But people wanted a home, or they wanted a home from home. They wanted another place to be. And we kind of thought, well, actually, this is the right time to do that. We found an old Methodist chapel and created the first ever arts venue in the whole of East Years. We were really surprised when we realised that it had never, remember 160,000 people, there had never been an arts venue in East Leeds. In Leeds, yes, but not in this area. And that's one of my really interesting bits, that sort of social inequalities, cultural inequalities mirror social inequalities. You know, let's be honest, we're not doing a good job in changing those things. So 2014, we opened the first ever arts venue. This is it, Chapel FM. After a couple of years of working, and all sorts of different things happening there. We initially envisaged it as a radio station. We realized we created an arts centre. And I think that's really interesting, to allow things to change you as well, to allow what people bring to it. But it created a space. Theory of change. So we also needed to create, well, what is Chapel FM all about? And there's lots of stuff on here, but the important bit for me is the overall vision. The vision was to create East Leeds as a community that has pride, vision, and hope for the future. And that's a big undertaking from a building. How can a building actually change stuff? But it's been really interesting to see how it has changed over time. So we've been working there for 24 years. What have we achieved? Generations of people have been involved in communicating their thoughts and ideas through ELFM. 2 phases of development of £1.8 million has created a shared space used by all ages of people from the community. Young people, again, are at the forefront of the project. For me, I don't know, there's something about it that's really important, that they become leaders within that community. When we started working in East Leeds, we recognised how difficult it was to work with adults, that a lot of the adults in the area had given up. But the young people, the teenagers we worked with, still aspired, still had hope, had positivity. And the last thing, people come to Seacroft, and that's quite important for me, and people often don't understand it because they kind of think, well, it's a community venue, it's for the community. But actually, to change the narrative in this area is that people from other parts of the city and internationally all over the place come to Seacroft. They don't come for any other reason. And that changes how the place is. And it changes the pride of the people who are there. And it changes the experience of the young people. And it changes the way people see the area. So when they come into the building, there's often this sort of, people will say, this is amazing, this is a beautiful place. And people from Leeds, they don't ever say it, but there's a little bit at the end of it, which is actually, this is a beautiful place and it's in Seacroft. And that in itself changes things. Can we shift power? I think it's been a play. That community, no one ever in that community said, we want an art centre. Yeah, it's been a play. It was about the offers and the responses. It's about sort of saying what would happen if, and actually having those responses. What is it that brings us together? Again, this is a space that brings people together. There wasn't anything like this before. And now you get, you know, those sorts of interactions between people. You know, the under fives who do their music class have done something with the over 70s who have a singing group. You know, all those sorts of formal and informal interactions. And I think that's really important. Can creative practice help? Again, it can't be everything. And I think, no, let's not pretend that creative practice is a panacea, but it can help. So what I wanted to talk about, we've talked about space a little bit, and just a few sort of thoughts on this. And it came to us, we were working with somebody in education, a researcher in education. She talked about the third space theory and how the most effective space for learning is between school and community. So if you imagine one side's school, one side's community, the interesting places in the middle. And what we started to realise, or I realised, was that learning is always more interesting in that space between institutions or between communities or between generations. And all our work inhabits the space between, sometimes even creating a space between. And that might be the space between the houses in the Methleys. It might be Chapel FM as a space between, but it's also the books we've created with people. All sorts of different possibilities create space between. And that sort of idea, this is where Ruby comes back in, my daughter. She's now got a master's in maths and is working for HMRC. And we were talking about, I like Venn diagrams, and she was talking about, well, actually, the names, the mathematical names for Venn diagrams, that red bit in the middle is the intersection, but the whole thing is the union. And when I talk about union, one of the things is it reminds me of that. And I think the challenge is, in a sense, to not live on the margins, which is the tradition for artists, but to inhabit the intersection, the space between, and take responsibility for the union. How do we do that? And what's the job? many years ago, a young man, was working with a group of people and trying to explain what I did for a living. And you could see the faces blank over. So I stopped. A couple of days later, that one of the young men came to me and he said, I've worked out what you do for a living. You ponce around for a living. And he said it with absolute respect. And still, when people ask me what I do for a living, sometimes I say it and then I have to explain, but I always think it. I'm allowed to do that. But what do? I'm an activist. I think I'm an artist. I'd struggle with the term. It means so little and so many different things to different people. I am a collaborator. I love that bit of working with people. I observe and listen. I love that side of things. And I'm a researcher. I did, when I first wrote this, put inquisitor, but I think that harkens back to the Spanish Inquisition or Star Wars. So I research, I look at things. I have to be a storyteller. Although I am terrified of narrative, I'm scared. We're not the best ones at narrative at the moment. The right is very good at narrative. There are all sorts of things happening in this world that are based on narrative. And I'm scared at how much people believe narrative, but I know I use it. I'm a teacher.
4 more minutes, Adrian.
That's fine. I'm a teacher, but I love learning. I'm a facilitator. I help make things happen. I'm a producer. I make things happen. I'm a strategist. I work both on the inside and on the outside, and I have to inhabit the space between those. And one of the young women I was working with not long ago said, well, that's a multi-potentialite. I don't like the term, but I'd like to see myself as generally a well-tempered accompanist. And that's the job, I think, the role of the accompanist. So what's an accompanist? A person who plays a musical accompaniment for another performer, especially a pianist accompanying a singer. To accompany is to convoy, to escort, to attend, to go with or alongside, to support by performing a subsidiary part. And this is where it came from. I was working with the musician Jack Glover up at the Upper Springland Centre in Perth for quite a few years. And we would do something where, just together, just for the hell of it, where he was playing probably piano and I was improvising in dance and movement. Remember, Heads Together started out as a physical theatre company. And amazing things happening just for the two of us, just be between us. And the question at the end of it was, where did that come from? And it was Jack who sort of said, well, actually, we accompanied each other. So what an accompanist does is both lead and follow. Although we think of an accompanist as just the person who follows, if even in traditional terms, if the singer's going too slowly, the accompanist leads, the accompanist takes it faster and stuff. And it struck me that actually it is a subsidiary role, and we don't like the idea that actually we're not as important, but to be able to accompany is a real skill, to know how to lead, to follow, or even to get to the point when we don't know. We don't know where the ideas came from, where the project came from. And I think that really fits back with that question, can we shift power? Because actually, if we want communities to shift power, we have to model that in ourselves. We have to find ways that we can actually shift power, that we can be prepared to make offers, to take responsibility for ideas and starting something. But we also have to be ready to listen and to take an idea from a 2-year-old. And my last point is just really is how do we train accompanists? And that's what really interests me. And I suppose that's what I've been working on for the last few years. And we're back to Venn diagrams and we're back to union. And this is very much the Northern School for Creativity and Activism is looking at how we do that. And we've, well, I don't know if we thought about this, but I realize now thinking about it, how do we train accompanists? We accompany them. We model what we're talking about. So the training that we're involved in across the north of England, I'm not going to go into it now, but Union 23 is our next program. It's taking a cohort of, this is mid-career artists and activists. That's the Venn diagram bit. There are lots of activists who use creativity every day of their lives. and who say, and have said to me, of course I'm not an artist. And how much is that because we build these barriers around the arts world about how special we are. So anyway, artists and activists, 5 workshops during the year accompanying their work, co-creating the program itself. So there is no agenda, there is no syllabus to begin with. One-to-one coaching. Coaching is all about working with the person about where they were, and modelling the opportunity to learn from funded collaborations between participants. So really my thinking is that if we believe in this work and we believe in how it can work, then we have to make sure that we train people in the same way, that we model the work at every point. And finally, just my last slide, there's a completely different project all in my mind. It's a mental health project. And in the evaluation, someone left this postcard. I have no idea who it was. Why they left it wasn't particularly appropriate to what they were asked to write on the postcard, but it's always struck me that it's not a bad starting point. Be open-minded, supportive, creative, and brave. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Adrian. So many things to think about. I've taken lots of notes, but yeah, talking about multiple identities, that in-between space that artists can inhabit, the barriers around being an artist. I really love that idea of the opportunity to take responsibility for the whole. I think that's quite a different way of working. It's certainly what we're really interested in here at the Stove. Yeah, so much. So thank you very much for that.